The afternoon of the St. Mary Mead Summer Charity Fete possessed that peculiar quality of English perfection that seems almost too deliberate to be natural. The sun filtered through the ancient elm trees surrounding Meadowbrook Manor's grounds with mathematical precision, casting dappled shadows across pristine white tablecloths laden with the finest bone china. The air carried the mingled fragrances of Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses, fresh scones cooling on silver platters, and the subtle bergamot notes of Earl Grey tea steeping in Georgian silver urns. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a wrought-iron chair beneath the spreading branches of an oak tree, her knitting needles moving with the gentle rhythm of long practice. Her soft blue eyes, deceptively mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles, missed nothing of the careful choreography unfolding before her. She observed how Mrs. Amelia Cartwright, the formidable mistress of Meadowbrook Manor, moved between the tables with the precision of a general inspecting troops, adjusting a doily here, repositioning a cake stand there, her silver hair immaculate beneath a hat that had undoubtedly cost more than most villagers earned in a month. The cucumber sandwiches must be arranged precisely so, Mrs. Cartwright declared to her harried assistant, young Sarah Mills from the post office, who bobbed her head nervously while clutching a tray of delicate triangular offerings. Lady Hetherington has very particular standards, and we simply cannot disappoint her. Lady Agnes Hetherington, the mention of whom could silence a room or start a heated discussion depending upon the company, had indeed graced the fete with her presence. She sat imperiously at a small table positioned strategically near the sundial, where she could observe the proceedings while maintaining her customary air of aristocratic detachment. Her sharp eyes surveyed the gathering with the calculating gaze of a hawk studying a field of mice. Her thin lips curved in what might generously be called a smile, but which suggested she found the entire proceeding mildly amusing in its provincial earnestness. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the subtle tensions weaving through the seemingly peaceful gathering like underground currents. Dr. Geoffrey Thorne, the village's new physician, stood near the Morris dancing platform, his handsome face wearing an expression of polite interest that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was listening to Colonel Bantry's endless recounting of military adventures with the patience of a saint, though Miss Marple noticed how his fingers drummed silently against his trouser leg, a man counting time until escape became possible. Across the lawn, near the rose arbor where the afternoon light caught the blooms at their most spectacular, Miss Penelope Davies engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Mr. Charles Redding, the artist who had taken the river cottage for the summer. Miss Davies, whose recent inheritance of her uncle's considerable estate had surprised many in the village, gestured emphatically with her gloved hands, while Mr. Redding leaned closer, his bohemian appearance, paint-stained fingers and carelessly tied cravat, marking him as distinctly out of place among the village's more conventional residents. Such a shame about the Davies inheritance. Miss Marple heard Mrs. Caroline Finch, the vicar's wife, murmur to Mr. Arthur Penhaligon, the village solicitor. One would have thought Sir John might have considered his obligations to the church more seriously. Her voice carried the particular tone reserved for discussing matters that were simultaneously shocking and delicious. Mr. Penhaligon, a portly man whose perpetually worried expression suggested he carried the weight of everyone's secrets, merely nodded while adjusting his spectacles with nervous precision. As the village's primary legal adviser, he was indeed privy to a great many confidences, and Miss Marple had often observed how this knowledge seemed to press upon him like a physical burden. The afternoon progressed with the measured cadence of ritual. The Morris dancers performed their ancient steps with bells jingling merrily. Children darted between the stalls, with sticky fingers and bright faces, and the gentle murmur of conversation created a backdrop of civilized contentment. Yet Miss Marple, with her lifetime's experience in observing human nature, sensed the undercurrents of tension that ran beneath the surface like fault lines in apparently solid ground. She noticed how Lady Hetherington's gaze lingered with particular intensity on certain individuals, A sharp look toward Dr. Thorne when he laughed at something Colonel Bantry said, a calculating stare in the direction of Miss Davies and Mr. Redding, a thin smile when Mrs. Cartwright hurried past with obvious anxiety. There was something predatory in the old woman's attention, as if she were a cat who had spotted several particularly interesting mice and was deciding which to pounce upon first. At precisely 25 minutes past 3, as Mrs. Cartwright was preparing to announce the official opening of the tea service, a sharp cry pierced the genteel atmosphere. It came from the direction of the sundial, where Lady Hetherington sat alone at her carefully positioned table. The ornate porcelain teacup she had been raising to her lips lay shattered on the grass, its contents spreading in a dark stain across the pristine white cloth. Lady Hetherington herself had slumped forward, her gloved hand still extended as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. Her face, usually a mask of aristocratic disdain, was contorted in an expression of surprise and something that might have been fear. Her lips had taken on a distinctly unnatural hue, a faint blue tinge that spoke of something far more sinister than a simple fainting spell. Dr. Thorne, responding with the swift professionalism of his calling, reached her side in moments. His examination was brief but thorough, his face growing increasingly grave as he checked for signs of life that were clearly absent. When he straightened, his expression told the assembled guests everything they needed to know before he spoke a single word. "I'm afraid Lady Hetherington is dead," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent gathering. The transformation was immediate and complete. The cheerful chatter died away as if someone had drawn a curtain across the afternoon. The Morris dancers' bells fell silent, their colorful ribbons hanging motionless in the still air. Mrs. Cartwright stood frozen beside the tea urn, her face pale with shock and the dawning realization that her perfectly planned fate had become the scene of something far more serious than social disappointment. Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair, her knitting set aside with careful precision. As she moved with deceptive casualness toward the scene of tragedy, her mind was already beginning to catalogue the details that others, in their shock and confusion, would surely overlook. The positioning of the broken teacup, the specific expression frozen on Lady Hetherington's face, the reactions of each individual as the news spread through the crowd like ripples on a disturbed pond. Death had indeed arrived before the afternoon tea was served, uninvited but not, Miss Marple suspected, entirely unexpected. In her long experience with the darker aspects of human nature, she'd learned that such dramatic departures from life were rarely as sudden or as accidental as they first appeared. Someone among this gathering of respectable villagers had decided that Lady Agnes Hetherington had lived quite long enough, and Miss Marple intended to discover who had possessed both the motive and the means to ensure that her ladyship would never again cast her calculating gaze over the affairs of St. Mary Mead. The game, as her nephew Raymond might say, was afoot, and in the lengthening shadows of what had begun as such a perfect English afternoon, Miss Marple prepared to match her wits against a mind clever enough to commit murder in full view of half the village, yet confident enough to believe they could escape detection. The tea would have to wait. There were far more pressing matters to attend to now. Shock rippled through Meadowbrook Manor's lawns as if the summer air itself had shivered. The Morris dancers' bells fell silent, their colorful ribbons hanging motionless, while children were quietly bundled toward the lemonade stand by parents whose faces had suddenly grown pale and serious. The genteel murmur of afternoon conversation died away, replaced by an electric tension that seemed to charge the very atmosphere. Mrs. Cartwright stood frozen beside the silver tea urn, her meticulous composure shattered like the porcelain cup that lay scattered on the grass. "But this is impossible," she whispered, her voice high and strained. She was perfectly well just moments ago. I saw her myself, sitting there so calmly, waiting for the tea service to begin. Her hands fluttered helplessly over the abandoned refreshment tables, as if the proper arrangement of cucumber sandwiches might somehow restore order to a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. Colonel Bantry, his military bearing asserting itself in crisis, immediately took charge. "Everyone please step back and give the doctor room," he commanded, though his voice carried a tremor that suggested even his considerable experience with death had not prepared him for this particular scenario. "We must preserve the scene until the authorities arrive." Dr. Thorne knelt beside Lady Hetherington's motionless form, his professional examination swift but thorough. "The symptoms suggest some form of rapid-acting poison," he said quietly to the colonel, though his words carried clearly in the hushed atmosphere. The discoloration around the lips, the expression of surprise. This was not a natural death. The word poison sent a fresh shudder through the crowd, and theories began to sprout like mushrooms after rain. Mrs. Caroline Finch crossed herself reflexively while muttering prayers. "Someone has committed murder right here among us," she whispered, her eyes darting meaningfully toward Miss Davies, who stood pale and shaken beside Mr. Redding. The implication was clear. The recently enriched Miss Davies, whose inheritance had deprived the village church of Lady Hetherington's expected legacy, certainly had motive for harboring grudges. Mr. Arthur Penhaligon adjusted his spectacles nervously, his solicitor's mind already working through the implications. Lady Hetherington had many complicated relationships within the community, he said carefully. She was not, perhaps, universally beloved. His glance toward Dr. Thorne was subtle but noticeable. After all, the new physician had access to various substances, and Lady Hetherington's vocal complaints about his modern methods were well known. "Must be an outsider," Colonel Bantry declared with characteristic bluster. "Some ruffian who slipped in amongst us. These village events attract all sorts." His gaze swept meaningfully over Mr. Redding, whose bohemian attire and paint-stained fingers marked him as decidedly unconventional among the tweed and linen of local society. Miss Marple moved quietly among these fragmenting groups, her presence so unassuming that people continued their conversations as if she were invisible. She observed how each theory reflected more about the speaker's prejudices than actual evidence, Mrs. Finch's concern with social propriety, Mr. Penhaligon's lawyer's instinct to consider all possibilities, Colonel Bantry's military need for external enemies. She noticed, too, the small details others missed. The squeezed lemon slice with its two pearly seeds glistening on Lady Hetherington's saucer, the fact that her ladyship had poured her own tea from the nearest urn, the careful way Charles Redding and Miss Davies avoided looking at each other. Young Sarah Mills burst into tears. "It's too awful." Lady Hetherington was always so particular about everything. Her distress was genuine, yet tinged with resentment that spoke of frequent criticism from the deceased. Even this small detail, Miss Marple noted, might prove significant. The distant sound of a police motor car approaching along the village lane announced Inspector Craddock's arrival. The familiar figure cut through the bewildered crowd with practiced efficiency, his questions crisp and direct. Constables began cordoning off the area around the sundial, taking names and addresses, trying to piece together Lady Hetherington's final moments. As the initial shock wore off, whispers grew bolder. "Did you see her face? She always had enemies, didn't she?" Perhaps the doctor made a mistake. He is new, after all. The theories multiplied, each more elaborate than the last, yet each containing fragments of truth about the complex web of relationships that bound St. Mary Mead together. Miss Marple understood that in these immediate reactions lay the seeds of solution. The obvious suspect was rarely the true culprit, and the most vocal accusers often had the most to hide. The perfect English afternoon had been transformed into something far more sinister, and among the scattered teacups and abandoned Morris dancing ribbons, a killer walked free, confident in their cleverness, but unaware that Miss Jane Marple was already beginning to unravel the threads of their carefully constructed deception. Miss Marple settled herself on a weathered wooden bench beneath the spreading branches of an ancient yew, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as Inspector Craddock began his methodical examination of the scene. From this carefully chosen vantage point, she appeared to be merely another elderly lady seeking respite from the afternoon's shocking events. Yet her position allowed her to observe both the physical evidence and the subtle interplay of human reactions that would prove far more revealing than any forensic examination. Inspector Craddock worked with the systematic precision she had come to expect from him, directing constables to preserve the area around the sundial while he conducted preliminary interviews. His questions followed predictable patterns, but Miss Marple noted with interest how each witness's responses revealed as much about their own character as about Lady Hetherington's final moments. Mrs. Cartwright approached the inspector with her chin raised in defiant dignity, though her hands trembled slightly as she gestured toward the tea service. Everything was prepared according to the highest standards. She insisted, her voice carrying the strain of someone whose reputation hung in the balance. 2 urns, freshly boiled at 2:30, Earl Grey and Darjeeling, each clearly marked with chalked cards. Lady Hetherington arrived early, inspected the arrangements personally, and chose to wait at the sundial where the afternoon light was, in her words, tolerable. Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Cartwright's eyes flickered nervously toward the tea urns, as if betrayal might have crept among her careful preparations. Dr. Thorne's testimony carried the controlled calm of medical training, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he described his examination. The symptoms suggest rapid-acting alkaloid poisoning, he explained to Craddock. The cyanosis around the lips, the expression of surprise. This was neither natural nor accidental. When questioned about his own medical supplies, a subtle flicker crossed his features. Miss Marple filed away his defensive response about keeping dangerous compounds locked in his motor car, noting the faint tea stain on his shirt cuff that might have occurred when Lady Hetherington's cup fell. Young Sarah Mills twisted her apron nervously as she recounted her final interaction with the deceased. Lady Hetherington was very particular about the lemon slices. She asked me to fetch a fresh one from the manor kitchen, saying the ones on the table looked wilted. The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. She also wanted to know specifically which urn contained the Earl Grey. Very insistent about that, she was. Miss Marple found this detail intriguing. Lady Hetherington's fastidiousness was legendary, but requesting items from the kitchen suggested either exceptional pickiness or a specific purpose. Miss Davies and Mr. Redding provided their accounts while standing carefully apart, as if proximity might suggest conspiracy. Miss Davies maintained her composure with visible effort, her gloved hands clasped tightly together. Lady Hetherington called me over just before it happened. She wanted to discuss my uncle's estate, something about papers requiring immediate attention. Her voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. She seemed almost pleased about something, which struck me as most unusual. Mr. Redding's artistic eye had captured details others missed. She kept checking her pocket watch and glancing toward the manor house. When someone approached her table, I couldn't see clearly from my position, she actually smiled. A genuine expression of satisfaction, not her usual thin-lipped grimace. This observation suggested Lady Hetherington had been expecting a particular visitor, someone whose arrival brought pleasure rather than irritation. Mr. Penhaligon's testimony proved most revealing in what it concealed. The solicitor adjusted his spectacles nervously while confirming that Lady Hetherington had recently revised her will, though he refused to elaborate, citing client confidentiality. She was a woman of strong convictions and considerable influence, he said carefully, his gaze avoiding direct contact with any of the assembled witnesses. As constables collected the scattered fragments of porcelain and bagged the remaining tea service items, Miss Marple observed the physical evidence with practiced attention. The broken cup lay in a specific pattern, suggesting Lady Hetherington had been raising it to her lips when the poison took effect. The silver spoon rested to the left of the saucer rather than the right, though her ladyship was right-handed. Most intriguingly, 2 small lemon seeds lay like pearls on the china, while a single thin slice remained in the crystal dish. Village gossip swirled around these official proceedings like autumn leaves in a wind. Mrs. Finch confided to anyone within hearing that Lady Hetherington had recently threatened to expose certain improprieties. At the parish council meeting, Mrs. Giles mentioned unpaid bills and sharp words about inferior baking. Colonel Bantry muttered about unpleasant business regarding church committee decisions. Through it all, Miss Marple continued her quiet knitting, her mind cataloguing not just the physical evidence but the intricate web of relationships, resentments, and secrets that bound St. Mary Mead together. The killer walked among them, confident in their cleverness, unaware that human nature inevitably revealed itself through small, seemingly insignificant details that spoke volumes to those who understood the eternal patterns of village life and the darker impulses that occasionally surfaced beneath its civilized veneer. The afternoon shock crystallized into something approaching relief, as Inspector Craddock's investigation quickly identified what appeared to be an obvious suspect. Dr. Geoffrey Thorne, with his medical knowledge and recent conflicts with Lady Hetherington, presented such a neat solution that the village seemed almost eager to embrace it. The evidence arranged itself with suspicious convenience, each piece fitting together like components of a well-oiled mechanism designed to produce a single, inevitable conclusion. The case against the young physician appeared compelling from every angle. Lady Hetherington had made no secret of her disapproval of his modern medical practices, loudly proclaiming at the previous month's parish council meeting that newfangled treatments and foreign ideas were corrupting the village's traditional values. Her campaign to replace him with a physician of the old school, one who understood proper decorum and established methods, had gained uncomfortable momentum among the more conservative residents, threatening to destroy his nascent practice before it could properly establish itself. Inspector Craddock's questioning revealed the damning extent of Dr. Thorne's access to lethal substances. His medical bag, secured in his motor car, contained various alkaloid compounds including strychnine for treating nervous conditions and digitalis for heart ailments. When pressed about his whereabouts during the crucial period, his account proved frustratingly vague. "I was circulating among the guests, as one does at such events," he explained, his voice carrying a defensive edge. "I spoke with Colonel Bantry about his rheumatism, examined young Timothy Fletcher's scraped knee, discussed the weather with Mrs. Henderson. Yet none of these interactions could be precisely timed, leaving gaps that might have allowed for fatal preparation. Colonel Bantry, despite his genuine friendship with the doctor, found himself unable to provide the alibi that might have cleared him. Thorne was indeed speaking with me about my joints," he admitted reluctantly, his military precision failing him when applied to the casual rhythms of village social life. "But I'm afraid I can't say precisely when. Could have been 2:30, could have been nearer 3. Time has a way of flowing at these gatherings, doesn't it?" The physical evidence seemed to support the theory of medical murder with uncomfortable clarity. Young Sarah Mills, her voice barely above a whisper, testified that she had observed Dr. Thorne examining the tea arrangements with unusual care. He was asking about the temperature of the water, whether the tea had been properly steeped. "I thought it was just professional interest. Doctors notice everything, don't they? But now..." Her voice trailed off, leaving implications hanging in the air like morning mist over the village pond. The constable discovered additional circumstantial evidence in the form of a small glass vial beneath the rose bushes near the sundial. Though empty, traces of an unknown substance clung to its interior walls, and Dr. Thorne's protestations of ignorance seemed increasingly hollow as each piece of evidence mounted against him. The village embraced this solution with visible relief. Here was an outsider, a newcomer whose modern methods had always seemed slightly suspect, whose removal would restore their comfortable equilibrium. Miss Marple observed these developments with growing unease, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm while her mind worked through inconsistencies that others seemed eager to overlook. The timing troubled her most profoundly. Lady Hetherington had been poisoned with remarkable precision, dying at the exact moment when maximum shock and confusion would result. Such timing suggested intimate knowledge of both the victim's habits and the afternoon schedule. Yet Dr. Thorne was relatively new to the village and had never attended one of Mrs. Cartwright's charity events before. More significantly, Miss Marple had observed Dr. Thorne's genuine surprise when Lady Hetherington collapsed. His immediate medical response had been instinctive and professional, not the calculated performance of a guilty man ensuring his victim's death. His hands had trembled with shock rather than nervous guilt, and his examination had been thorough rather than perfunctory. A murderer, in her experience, might have declared death more quickly, avoiding close scrutiny that could reveal inconsistencies in their carefully constructed deception. The matter of Lady Hetherington's specific requests also nagged at her orderly mind. The insistence on fresh lemon slices from the kitchen, the particular interest in which urn contained Earl Grey, these seemed oddly specific for someone who would accept tea from a person she actively despised. Miss Marple recalled Mr. Redding's observation about Lady Hetherington's genuine smile just before her death, an expression of satisfaction rather than her usual thin-lipped disapproval. Would she smile at the man whose career she was attempting to destroy? As Inspector Craddock prepared to escort Dr. Thorne away for further questioning, the village watched with a mixture of fascination and relief. The Morris dancers began quietly packing their bells, Mrs. Cartwright supervised the clearing of abandoned refreshments, and normal life prepared to resume its comfortable patterns. The obvious suspect would be processed through proper channels, justice would be served, and St. Mary Mead could return to its peaceful routines. Miss Marple rose quietly from her bench, her knitting carefully secured in its basket. She approached Inspector Craddock with the deferential manner that made her appear harmless to those who underestimated elderly ladies, with sharp eyes and sharper minds. "Inspector," she said gently, "might I have just a moment? I believe there may be one or two small details worth considering before you proceed." The real killer, she suspected, remained hidden among them like a serpent in their carefully tended garden of respectability, protected by the very obviousness of the solution everyone was so eager to accept. Miss Marple approached Inspector Craddock with the gentle persistence that had served her well through decades of village mysteries, her mild expression masking the sharp precision with which she had catalogued details others had dismissed as insignificant. The afternoon shock was crystallizing into premature certainty, and she recognized the dangerous comfort of an obvious solution that fit too neatly to be entirely truthful. "Inspector," she said quietly, positioning herself where their conversation would remain private, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity about the physical evidence. There are one or two small inconsistencies that trouble me rather considerably." Craddock, who had learned through experience to respect Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations, paused in his preparations. "What sort of inconsistencies, Miss Marple?" "The teaspoon, for instance. It rests on the left side of Lady Hetherington's saucer, yet she was decidedly right-handed. I've observed her at countless village functions. She would never place her spoon there naturally. More significantly, the spoon appears completely clean, as if it had never been used for stirring." Miss Marple's walking stick indicated the bagged evidence with delicate precision. She continued her gentle reconstruction, each observation delivered with casual certainty. Then there's the matter of the lemon slice. Young Sarah mentioned that Lady Hetherington specifically requested fresh lemon from the kitchen, complaining about the table arrangements, yet 2 small seeds lay separately on her saucer. Rather unusual placement for someone so fastidious about her tea service. Inspector Craddock's notebook emerged as these details accumulated into something more substantial than coincidence. Miss Marple seized the moment to suggest a brief investigation that might clarify matters considerably. The kitchen of Meadowbrook Manor retained the honest warmth of traditional service, its scrubbed surfaces and orderly arrangements speaking of Mrs. Birch's competent management. The cook, flour-dusted and formidable, welcomed Miss Marple's gentle inquiries with the automatic courtesy accorded to respected village residents. Fresh lemon. Yes, indeed, Mrs. Birch confirmed, wiping her hands methodically. Lady Hetherington sent that girl back, claiming the table slices looked tired. Nonsense, of course. They were cut proper at noon, paper thin and de-seeded as Mrs. Cartwright requires. But I cut a fresh one to stop the fuss. 2 good slices on the gold-rimmed plate. Sarah Mills, summoned from the scullery, nodded vigorously. I carried the plate toward the lawn, but Mrs. Cartwright intercepted me near the roses. She took the plate herself and instructed me to deliver just 1 slice directly to Lady Hetherington at the sundial. Said she'd handle the other slice for the crystal dish. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing interest. Mrs. Cartwright handled the lemon slice personally. How very efficient of her. The kitchen table bore evidence of recent lemon preparation, a dried half and a small knife that carried the faintest acrid note beneath its citrus fragrance, something that didn't quite belong in honest kitchens. Returning to the lawn, Miss Marple examined the tea service arrangements with renewed attention. The chalked labels marking Earl Grey and Darjeeling showed faint smudges, as if they had been handled or adjusted recently. A barely visible ring of moisture on the sundial's base suggested something, perhaps a small plate, had been set down briefly and retrieved. The evidence suggests a rather different sequence of events, Miss Marple explained to Inspector Craddock, her voice carrying quiet conviction. Lady Hetherington's particular requests, the fresh lemon, the specific inquiry about Earl Grey, indicate she was taking unusual precautions. Yet she smiled, genuinely just before her collapse. Would she smile at Dr. Thorne, whose career she was actively undermining? The inspector frowned as his neat case developed uncomfortable complications. What are you suggesting happened? I believe our murderer understood Lady Hetherington's habits intimately and used her fastidiousness against her. The poison wasn't stirred into the tea, hence the unused spoon. Instead, it was introduced through the fresh lemon slice she specifically requested. A small injection of concentrated poison would be masked by the citrus tartness and Earl Grey's bergamot. When she squeezed the lemon, the seeds would naturally separate, explaining their placement on the saucer. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she allowed these observations to settle. The glass vial beneath the roses was planted deliberately, rather too conveniently discovered to be genuine evidence. Our real murderer is someone Lady Hetherington trusted, someone with intimate knowledge of the afternoon's arrangements and access to both the lemon preparation and the tea service. Someone who could predict precisely when and how she would take her tea, Craddock concluded grimly, understanding dawning in his expression. Indeed, this was not Dr. Thorne's crime of obvious means, but a more subtle art. Murder disguised as hospitality, executed by someone who moved so naturally through the afternoon's events that their actions appeared entirely innocent. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes surveyed the dispersing crowd with renewed purpose. The killer walks among us still, Inspector, confident in their cleverness but unaware that human nature inevitably reveals itself through the smallest details to those who understand village life's eternal patterns. Inspector Craddock established his temporary headquarters in Meadowbrook Manor's oak-paneled library, where leather-bound volumes and the lingering scent of beeswax created an atmosphere of judicial solemnity, wholly at odds with the chaos unfolding on the sun-dappled lawns outside. Miss Marple positioned herself discreetly in a high-backed chair near the mullioned windows, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm, while her sharp blue eyes catalogued every nuance of expression and gesture as the village's residents filed through like reluctant witnesses before a tribunal. Mr. Arthur Penhaligon entered first, his collar askew and spectacles fogging with nervous perspiration. The solicitor's usual professional composure had cracked under the weight of circumstances, revealing a man burdened by secrets that suddenly carried deadly implications. "Inspector, you must understand that my position requires absolute discretion regarding client affairs," he began, polishing his spectacles with unnecessary vigor. "I appreciate your professional obligations, Mr. Penhaligon," Craddock replied with measured patience. "But murder rather changes the circumstances. Had Lady Hetherington recently altered her will?" The solicitor's mouth worked silently for several moments before capitulation overtook discretion. "She executed a codicil yesterday evening, here at the manor. It was properly witnessed by Mrs. Birch and Thomas the footman. She intended to deliver it to my office today for filing, but—" His voice trailed off as the implications settled like dust in the afternoon light. "And the contents of this codicil?" "Significant redistributions, Inspector. Charitable bequests previously promised to St. Mary's Restoration Fund were diverted to a district nursing trust. More personally, there were provisions concerning the river cottage. Mr. Redding was to receive a long-term lease under specific conditions." Penhaligon's glance toward Miss Marple carried the weight of a man seeking absolution for breaking confidences. Miss Marple absorbed this information while maintaining her appearance of gentle preoccupation with her knitting. The missing codicil represented more than legal documentation. It was a weapon that could destroy carefully laid plans and long-held expectations. Someone had ensured it would never reach the solicitor's office. Mrs. Caroline Finch swept into the library with the righteous indignation of someone defending divine spreadsheets. Lady Hetherington had solemnly promised funds for the east window restoration. She declared, her cheeks flushed with moral fervor. "We have commitments to craftsmen, contracts with glaziers." If she intended to renege on sacred obligations, she was clearly acting under malicious influence. The implication hung in the air like incense, pointing toward anyone who might have benefited from the charitable redirection. Yet Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Finch's eyes avoided direct contact with the inspector, suggesting secrets that went deeper than disappointed fundraising expectations. Charles Redding followed, his usually paint-stained fingers scrubbed clean and a silk scarf knotted with uncharacteristic precision at his throat. Lady Hetherington commissioned 2 portraits, he explained with studied nonchalance. She declared the first made her appear like a moral essay and the second like a mystery novel. I confess I preferred the second assessment. His artistic eye had captured details others missed. She was examining something in her hand just before the collapse, a small folded paper. When she looked up and saw her visitor approaching, her expression transformed into what I can only describe as vindictive satisfaction. Miss Davies entered with rigid composure that barely concealed underlying distress. Lady Hetherington summoned me just before the tea service began. She testified, her voice carefully controlled. She claimed to have discovered irregularities in my uncle's estate, documents that required immediate attention. Her manner was almost triumphant, as if she relished delivering disturbing news. The young woman's hands trembled slightly as she continued. She spoke of a reckoning, of corrections that would restore proper order to financial arrangements. Mrs. Amelia Cartwright entered last, her silver hair immaculate beneath her expensive hat. though Miss Marple observed the faint tremor in her gloved hands and the defensive set of her shoulders. "Inspector, I cannot comprehend why my management of the refreshment service should be considered significant," she protested with brittle dignity. "Lady Hetherington was notoriously particular about her tea arrangements. I merely ensured her specific requirements were met with appropriate attention." "Yet you personally intercepted the lemon delivery, rather than allowing Sarah Mills to complete her task." Craddock pressed gently. "Efficiency, Inspector. The girl is willing but inexperienced in handling demanding guests." Mrs. Cartwright's explanation carried subtle inconsistencies that Miss Marple filed away for future consideration. Young Sarah Mills, summoned from the scullery, provided the most damning testimony of all. Mrs. Birch cut 2 perfect slices, paper thin and de-seeded as always, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But when I returned to collect the crystal dish later, the lemon slice there was different, thicker, less precise. I noticed because Lady Hetherington always complained about clumsy presentation. The physical evidence continued accumulating like storm clouds on a clear horizon. A constable reported that the codicil remained missing from Lady Hetherington's reticule and the writing desk, where she habitually secured important documents. More significantly, her distinctive gold pen with its sharp nib, often observed clipped to her pocketbook, had also vanished without trace. Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair, her knitting secured with characteristic precision. The afternoon's revelations had painted a portrait of Lady Hetherington as a woman who collected secrets like trophies, wielding knowledge of financial irregularities, past indiscretions, and hidden vulnerabilities as instruments of control. Her death had liberated multiple individuals from various forms of potential ruin, yet it had also created new dangers for whoever had orchestrated her demise. "Inspector," she said with gentle authority, "I believe we're dealing with someone who understood Lady Hetherington's character intimately. Her fastidiousness, her timing, her pleasure in orchestrating dramatic revelations. The killer used her own habits against her, ensuring that her final tea would indeed be her last." The murderer walked among them still, protected by the very respectability that had provided perfect camouflage for their carefully executed plan. Evening shadows stretched across Meadowbrook Manor's grounds as Inspector Craddock prepared to conclude his preliminary interviews, yet the investigation's momentum suddenly shifted when young Thomas the footman approached with obvious distress. He had been collecting abandoned teacups from the rose garden when something caught his attention beneath Mrs. Cartwright's prized damask bushes, something that would transform their understanding of Lady Hetherington's murder from simple poisoning into something far more calculated and desperate. "Inspector, sir," Thomas called, his voice tight with anxiety. "There's something hidden here that doesn't belong." His discovery sent fresh ripples of alarm through the already shaken community. Lady Hetherington's distinctive leather portfolio lay partially concealed among the thorny stems, its monogrammed surface stained with evening dew, and its contents scattered like fallen leaves across the damp earth. The missing codicil lay among the papers, deliberately torn into precise strips that rendered its legal language meaningless. More disturbing still was Lady Hetherington's gold fountain pen, its ornate barrel now bent at an unnatural angle and bearing dark stains that Dr. Thorne immediately identified as blood. The violence suggested in that twisted metal spoke of desperate fury rather than calculated planning. "This changes everything," Inspector Craddock muttered, his methodical investigation suddenly complicated by evidence that suggested the crime extended far beyond simple murder into realms of systematic deception and financial manipulation. Miss Marple examined the scattered documents with growing fascination, noting that while the codicil had been destroyed with obvious intent, other papers remained untouched. bank correspondence, estate management records, and what appeared to be detailed financial statements lay preserved, suggesting the destroyer had sought something specific rather than engaging in random destruction. Among the intact documents, one letter particularly caught her attention. Correspondence from a London banking house dated just 3 days prior, bearing urgent markings about irregularities in estate management fees. The language was diplomatically phrased, but unmistakably serious. Someone had been manipulating Lady Hetherington's financial affairs with considerable skill and audacity. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe Lady Hetherington discovered systematic embezzlement. These banking records suggest someone has been creative with estate management responsibilities for quite some time. Her codicil wasn't merely changing charitable bequests. It was exposing financial crimes." The implications rippled through the assembled group like stones dropped in still water. Mrs. Cartwright, summoned from the manor house where she had been supervising the clearing of refreshments, appeared with her usual composed efficiency, though Miss Marple noted the small adhesive bandage wrapped around her left index finger, a detail absent during the afternoon's festivities. "I cannot imagine why my management of estate accounts should be questioned," Mrs. Cartwright declared with brittle dignity when Craddock inquired about her administrative responsibilities. "Lady Hetherington relied on my efficiency for numerous practical matters. If someone has vandalized her papers, it merely demonstrates the sort of lawlessness that proper authority should prevent." Yet her composed facade flickered when Inspector Craddock produced the blood-stained fountain pen. The request to examine her injured finger hung in the air like an accusation, and Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Cartwright's eyes darted toward the financial documents with something approaching panic. Dr. Thorne's examination of the evidence provided crucial insights. The blood appears fresh, certainly within the last few hours. The pen's nib has been deliberately damaged, as if someone wanted to ensure it could never be used again. The injury that caused this bleeding was likely sustained during the destruction process. The psychological dimensions of the crime became increasingly clear as Miss Marple pieced together the evidence. Lady Hetherington had been orchestrating a final, devastating revelation, exposing years of financial manipulation, while simultaneously punishing those she felt had betrayed her trust. Her vindictive satisfaction moments before death now made perfect sense. She had been savoring a triumph that would destroy her killer's carefully constructed deception. The murderer faced a terrible dilemma. Miss Marple explained gently to Inspector Craddock. Killing Lady Hetherington wasn't enough. They also had to ensure her final accusations never saw daylight. The codicil contained more than inheritance changes. It contained evidence of systematic theft disguised as efficient administration. Young Sarah Mills, drawn by the commotion, provided the final piece of immediate evidence. "I saw Mrs. Cartwright walking quickly near the roses after Lady Hetherington collapsed. She was carrying something in both hands and looked frantic. When she noticed me watching, she immediately asked me to help clear the refreshment tables, but her manner was quite unlike her usual composed efficiency." The evening air grew heavy with unspoken accusations as the investigation's focus shifted dramatically. The comfortable theory of an outsider's crime dissolved into the far more disturbing reality of systematic betrayal by someone trusted implicitly with Lady Hetherington's most private affairs. Mrs. Cartwright's perfect composure was beginning to crack under the weight of accumulating evidence, revealing glimpses of the calculating mind that had orchestrated murder with such methodical precision. "Inspector," Miss Marple concluded softly, "we're dealing with someone who understood Lady Hetherington's character intimately, her habits, her timing, her pleasure in dramatic revelations. The killer used that knowledge to ensure her final tea would indeed be her last, then desperately tried to erase the evidence of years of financial manipulation that motivated the crime." The evening shadows lengthened across Meadowbrook Manor's grounds as Inspector Craddock's investigation took an unexpected turn. A thorough search of the rose garden had yielded more than the scattered portfolio. Hidden beneath Mrs. Cartwright's prized damask bushes, constables discovered a small glass vial bearing traces of what Dr. Thorne immediately identified as concentrated digitalis extract, along with a delicate silver letter opener that belonged to Lady Hetherington's writing desk. Miss Marple observed these developments with growing fascination, noting how each piece of evidence seemed almost too conveniently placed. The vial's position suggested hasty concealment rather than careful disposal, while the letter opener bore no fingerprints despite its ornate surface that should have retained clear impressions. Someone was working very hard to ensure the investigation reached specific conclusions. "Most curious," she murmured to Inspector Craddock as they examined the evidence. How these items appeared exactly where any systematic search would discover them, almost as if someone wanted to ensure they would be found at precisely the right moment. Mrs. Cartwright approached the group with her characteristic composed efficiency, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her gloved hands and the way her eyes avoided direct contact with the incriminating evidence. "Inspector, surely these discoveries prove that some intruder violated the grounds during the afternoon's confusion. The security of the manor has been compromised by this terrible business." Her explanation carried the ring of rehearsed conviction, yet Miss Marple detected subtle inconsistencies that spoke of careful preparation. The financial documents scattered earlier told a story of systematic manipulation spanning several years. Small adjustments to charitable donations, creative accounting for estate maintenance, and the gradual diversion of funds into accounts that existed only on paper. "Mrs. Cartwright," Miss Marple said with gentle directness, "I wonder if you might help clarify something that has been troubling me. Lady Hetherington's request for fresh lemon from the kitchen was most specific, yet she seemed genuinely pleased when someone approached her table just before her collapse. Would you happen to know who might have brought her such satisfaction?" The question appeared innocent enough, yet Mrs. Cartwright's reaction revealed the psychological pressure beneath her polished exterior. Her composed mask flickered momentarily, showing glimpses of the calculating desperation that had driven someone to murder disguised as hospitality. Lady Hetherington found satisfaction in many things, Miss Marple. Her attention to proper standards, her oversight of various administrative matters. The careful phrasing carried defensive undertones that suggested legal precision rather than conversational ease. Young Sarah Mills, summoned from the manor house, provided additional testimony that cast new shadows on the afternoon's events. "Mrs. Cartwright asked me to deliver a message to Mr. Penhaligon during the luncheon hour, but he wasn't in his office. I slipped it under his door as instructed. She seemed quite particular about the timing." This revelation sent Inspector Craddock's investigation in a new direction entirely. A hasty visit to the solicitor's office revealed signs of recent disturbance, filing cabinets left slightly ajar, papers arranged with suspicious neatness, and most significantly, the absence of several estate account ledgers that should have been secured in the locked drawer. "Someone has been through my files with considerable care," Mr. Penhaligon admitted reluctantly. The missing ledgers contained detailed records of Lady Hetherington's charitable donations and estate management fees spanning the past 5 years. Whoever took them understood exactly what they were looking for. Miss Marple absorbed this information while maintaining her appearance of gentle preoccupation with her knitting. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone had orchestrated not just murder, but a comprehensive effort to eliminate evidence of long-term financial manipulation. Yet the very thoroughness of these efforts suggested panic rather than calculation, desperation rather than cold planning. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we're dealing with someone who understood that Lady Hetherington's death alone wouldn't solve their problems. The codicils she intended to file contained more than inheritance changes. It contained accusations that would have destroyed a carefully constructed reputation built over decades of apparent respectability. Dr. Thorne's examination of the digitalis vial revealed additional complications. This concentration would have been lethal within minutes, yet the delivery method remains unclear. Digitalis has a distinctly bitter taste that would be difficult to mask in tea, even with lemon and bergamot. As night settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple recognized that they had reached the crucial moment when the guilty party would either confess under mounting pressure or attempt one final, desperate gambit to escape justice. The evidence pointed towards systematic financial crimes, spanning years, yet the physical proof had been contaminated by someone clever enough to stage false clues while destroying genuine documentation. "I believe," Miss Marple concluded softly, "that tomorrow morning will bring us either complete truth or one last, very dangerous deception. Our murderer has shown considerable ingenuity thus far. We must be prepared for their final performance." The psychological trap was set, waiting only for human nature to reveal itself through the eternal patterns that Miss Marple understood so intimately. Morning arrived with deceptive serenity over St. Mary Mead, the village attempting to restore its customary peace through the simple act of routine. Yet beneath the surface calm, Miss Marple understood that the most dangerous moment in any investigation had arrived. The moment when a cornered killer might attempt one final, desperate gambit to escape justice. She had spent the early hours in careful preparation, arranging what appeared to be a simple gesture of village solidarity. "Inspector Craddock," she had suggested with gentle insistence. "Perhaps we might gather the principal witnesses for a quiet tea at the vicarage. Nothing formal, you understand. Merely an opportunity to clarify a few remaining details while offering comfort during these distressing circumstances." The vicarage drawing room had been prepared with Miss Marple's characteristic attention to seemingly insignificant details. 2 silver urns sat precisely positioned on the mahogany sideboard. Earl Grey and Darjeeling, each marked with neat chalk labels. A crystal dish held paper-thin lemon slices arranged with mathematical precision, while a second plate bore thicker, less precise cuts that spoke of hurried preparation. The bone china service gleamed in the morning light, each cup and saucer positioned exactly as they had been during yesterday's fatal afternoon. Mrs. Cartwright arrived with her usual composed efficiency, though Miss Marple noted the slight stiffness in her movements that suggested someone bracing against anticipated revelation. The small adhesive bandage still decorated her left index finger, a detail that had been absent during yesterday's festivities but had appeared with suspicious timing after Lady Hetherington's collapse. "How kind of you to assist with the arrangements, Mrs. Cartwright," Miss Marple said with gentle warmth. "I confess I'm rather particular about tea service, though I'm sure my standards pale beside Lady Hetherington's exacting requirements. Perhaps you might demonstrate precisely how you prepared her afternoon refreshment yesterday. Inspector Craddock requires absolute accuracy for his official report." The request appeared innocuous enough, yet Mrs. Cartwright's eyes flickered with something approaching alarm. She moved through the familiar motions with practiced grace, testing water temperature with professional precision, arranging china with the efficiency of long experience, preparing lemon slices with surgical exactness. Yet Miss Marple observed the subtle tremors that betrayed underlying tension, the way her hands hesitated fractionally when handling the ornate teaspoons. Lady Hetherington was most particular about her Earl Grey. Mrs. Cartwright explained, her voice carrying defensive undertones that hadn't been present in previous conversations. "The water temperature must be precisely correct, the steeping time carefully measured. She trusted my expertise in these matters completely." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed with gentle directness. "Such trust must have been quite valuable to someone in your position. Tell me, When exactly did you first realize that Lady Hetherington suspected irregularities in the estate accounts? The question struck like lightning in a clear sky. Mrs. Cartwright's composed facade flickered momentarily, revealing glimpses of the desperate calculation that had driven someone to murder disguised as hospitality. Her hands stilled over the tea service, and when she looked up, her eyes carried the trapped expression of someone who had finally been cornered by circumstances beyond their control. "I'm not certain what you're implying, Miss Marple," she said carefully, though her voice lacked the conviction that had characterized her earlier statements. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she continued her reconstruction with relentless courtesy. "I think you understand perfectly well. Lady Hetherington discovered that her trusted administrator had been systematically embezzling funds for years. Small amounts initially, creative adjustments to charitable donations, imaginative accounting for maintenance expenses. But greed has a way of growing, doesn't it? Eventually, the amounts became substantial enough to attract attention from London banking houses. The psychological pressure mounted with each carefully chosen word. The codicil she intended to file yesterday wasn't merely changing inheritance provisions. It was formally accusing you of theft and demanding a complete audit of estate finances. Your reputation, your position, your entire carefully constructed life would have been destroyed by tea time. Mrs. Cartwright's teacup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to tremble with barely controlled emotion. Lady Hetherington was demanding. She expected perfection in all administrative matters. The careful phrasing carried defensive undertones that suggested legal precision rather than conversational ease. "Quite so. And you knew her habits intimately. Her fastidiousness about tea service, her pleasure in dramatic confrontations, her particular satisfaction in exposing what she considered moral failings." Miss Marple's voice carried the gentle authority of someone stating irrefutable facts. "When she summoned you yesterday morning to discuss irregularities, you realized your time had run out." Inspector Craddock, positioned strategically near the window, observed how Mrs. Cartwright's eyes darted toward the door with increasing frequency, as if calculating distances and possibilities for escape. Her composed mask was cracking under the weight of accumulated pressure, revealing glimpses of the calculating desperation that had driven her to murder. "The lemon slice was prepared in advance, wasn't it?" Miss Marple continued with inexorable gentleness. "You knew she would request fresh fruit from the kitchen when she noticed the table arrangements. You intercepted young Sarah's delivery and substituted your prepared slice, ensuring Lady Hetherington would consume the digitalis while believing she was taking her customary afternoon refreshment." Mrs. Cartwright's bandaged finger tightened around the porcelain handle as she struggled to maintain her composure. "These accusations are entirely unfounded. My service to Lady Hetherington's estate has always been beyond reproach. Yet you were observed by Sarah Mills, carrying something bulky from the rose garden shortly after Lady Hetherington's collapse, and you sustained that convenient cut to your finger, an injury that Dr. Thorne identified as consistent with handling a broken fountain pen under considerable stress." Miss Marple's needles clicked with mechanical precision. "An injury, I might add, that was covered by a bandage you didn't possess earlier in the day." The trap was closing with the inexorable precision of well-oiled machinery. Mrs. Cartwright's breathing became shallow and rapid as she realized that every careful precaution, every planted piece of false evidence, every desperate attempt to frame Dr. Thorne had been observed and catalogued by the deceptively mild elderly lady who sat knitting with such innocent concentration. The missing financial ledgers from Mr. Penhaligon's office. Miss Marple continued relentlessly. "Removed during the confusion while you ostensibly delivered a message that ensured his absence. The torn codicil, the blood-stained pen, the planted digitalis vial, all evidence of a mind clever enough to commit murder, yet desperate enough to believe it could escape detection through misdirection. Mrs. Cartwright's composed facade finally began to crumble completely. Her face had lost all colour, and her eyes darted between Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock with the trapped desperation of someone who understood that all avenues of escape had been systematically closed. She was going to... Mrs. Cartwright began, then stopped herself with visible effort, her lips pressed into a thin line that spoke of secrets still desperately guarded. Miss Marple smiled with gentle satisfaction, understanding that the psychological trap had achieved its intended effect. The final revelation would come soon enough, but for now it was sufficient to know that human nature had once again revealed itself through the eternal patterns she understood so intimately. The killer's composure was shattered, their confidence destroyed, and their guilt written clearly in every trembling gesture and desperate glance. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe Mrs. Cartwright has something she wishes to tell us, don't you, my dear?" The morning light streaming through the vicarage windows illuminated a scene of psychological checkmate, where years of careful deception were finally collapsing under the weight of one elderly lady's understanding of human nature and its inevitable weaknesses. The morning light streaming through the vicarage windows caught the delicate china with crystalline precision as Miss Marple observed Mrs. Cartwright's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain her composure. The tea service had been arranged with deliberate care, 2 silver urns positioned exactly as they had been during yesterday's fatal afternoon, complete with chalk labels that Miss Marple had quietly reversed while preparing the room. "Perhaps you might demonstrate once more how you prepared Lady Hetherington's refreshment yesterday," Miss Marple suggested with gentle insistence. "Inspector Craddock requires absolute accuracy for his official report." Mrs. Cartwright moved through the familiar motions with practiced efficiency, yet Miss Marple noted how her eyes flickered toward the chalk labels with barely concealed alarm. Without conscious thought, she reached toward the Earl Grey urn, then stopped herself, her hand trembling as she realized the psychological trap that had been laid with such innocent precision. "You corrected the labels without testing the contents," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Only someone intimately familiar with yesterday's arrangements would know which urn contained which tea, and you reached automatically for the thinner lemon slices, though I mentioned nothing about serving standards." The psychological pressure mounted with each gentle observation. Mrs. Cartwright's silver hair, always so immaculately arranged, had begun to escape its pins, and her gloved hands shook as she attempted to maintain the facade of efficient competence that had served her for decades. "The digitalis was delivered through the lemon slice, wasn't it?" Miss Marple continued with inexorable courtesy. A tiny puncture, barely visible, allowing the concentrated poison to be masked by the citrus tartness and Earl Grey's bergamot. When Lady Hetherington squeezed the lemon into her tea, she unknowingly administered her own death. Mrs. Cartwright's teacup rattled against its saucer as her carefully constructed composure finally began to crumble. "These accusations are entirely unfounded," she whispered, though her voice lacked the conviction that had characterized her earlier denials. "I think not," Miss Marple replied gently. The banking correspondence in Lady Hetherington's portfolio told a very clear story of systematic embezzlement spanning several years. Small adjustments initially, creative accounting for charitable donations, imaginative maintenance expenses, investment returns that reflected your needs rather than market realities. The revelation struck like lightning in clear sky. Mrs. Cartwright's face lost all color as she realized that every careful precaution, every planted piece of false evidence, every desperate attempt to frame Dr. Thorne had been observed and catalogued by the deceptively mild elderly lady who sat knitting with such innocent concentration. "She was going to destroy me," Mrs. Cartwright finally whispered, her voice barely audible in the sudden stillness. 23 years of faithful service, and she was prepared to cast me aside like a broken teacup because of financial arrangements she couldn't possibly understand. The confession poured out in carefully measured phrases, revealing the twisted logic that had transformed trusted service into systematic theft. Lady Hetherington lived so comfortably, never questioning expenses, never examining the detailed records I prepared so meticulously. Small adjustments here and there. Who would notice? Who would care about such minor discrepancies when the estate ran with perfect efficiency? Miss Marple recognized the familiar pattern of criminal psychology, the gradual transformation of theft into entitlement, of betrayal into justified compensation for unappreciated service. But the London banking house sent correspondence directly to her, didn't they? Questions about account reconciliation that you had always handled privately. She summoned me Tuesday morning with those banking letters spread across her writing desk like evidence in a criminal proceeding. Mrs. Cartwright continued, her voice carrying the bitter memory of exposure and humiliation. She spoke of audits and investigations, of criminal charges and public disgrace. The codicil she intended to file contained formal accusations that would have provided prosecutors with a complete case for fraud. The methodical planning that had characterized both her financial crimes and Lady Hetherington's murder became clear as she described the preparation. The digitalis was readily available from Dr. Thorne's medical supplies during his house calls. Lady Hetherington's habits were entirely predictable. Her insistence on fresh lemon, her preference for Earl Grey, her pleasure in dramatic confrontations. I prepared the lemon slice in advance, knowing she would request fresh fruit when she noticed the table arrangements. Inspector Craddock listened with grim attention as Mrs. Cartwright described the frantic minutes following Lady Hetherington's collapse, the destroyed codicil, the planted evidence, the missing ledgers from Mr. Penhaligon's office. Dr. Thorne was the obvious suspect. His medical knowledge, his conflicts with Lady Hetherington, his access to poisonous substances, all factors that would satisfy any reasonable investigation. Even as she confessed to murder and systematic fraud, Mrs. Cartwright maintained the defensive posture of someone who believed her actions had been justified by circumstances beyond her control. She would have ruined me completely. Not dismissed, destroyed. She delighted in public humiliation, in exposing what she considered moral failings. Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair, her knitting secured with characteristic precision. Inspector Craddock, I believe Mrs. Cartwright has told us everything we need to understand, both the crime and its motivation. Mrs. Cartwright straightened with visible effort as the constables approached, her administrative instincts asserting themselves even in defeat. I shall require time to arrange my affairs properly. There are estate matters that cannot be left in disorder. Even facing arrest for murder, she remained concerned with efficient management, a final demonstration of the obsessive control that had driven her to transform trusted service into systematic betrayal, and ultimately into the cold calculation of afternoon tea served with poison instead of sympathy. The morning light continued streaming through the vicarage windows, illuminating a scene where justice had finally emerged from the shadows of respectability, though at a cost that would forever change the peaceful rhythms of St. Mary Mead. The morning after Mrs. Cartwright's arrest dawned with deceptive tranquility over St. Mary Mead, though beneath the surface, calm, lay the profound psychological adjustments that follow the exposure of long-hidden corruption. The village attempted to restore its customary rhythms through the simple act of routine. Shopkeepers opened their doors with determined normalcy. Children resumed their games with subdued voices, and housewives hung washing on lines with the mechanical precision of people seeking comfort in familiar tasks. Miss Marple observed these efforts from her cottage garden, noting how the community's healing process would unfold in predictable stages. The initial shock would gradually transform into cautious reconstruction of trust, though the comfortable assumptions about respectability and service would never fully recover their former innocence. Dr. Thorne arrived at her garden gate before noon, his relief at vindication tempered by professional concern for his practice's future. "The irony troubles me considerably," he confided, accepting her invitation for tea. "I dedicated my career to healing, yet found myself suspected of the most calculated form of harm imaginable." "The village will remember your grace under pressure," Miss Marple assured him gently. "Your immediate response to Lady Hetherington's collapse demonstrated genuine medical instinct rather than guilty performance. Such integrity under false accusation often strengthens rather than weakens professional reputation." Indeed, Dr. Thorne's practice would flourish in the coming months as villagers recognized his professional competence and personal character. The crisis had tested his resolve and found it sound, earning him the deep respect that would serve as the foundation for decades of successful village medicine. Young Sarah Mills received perhaps the most transformative outcome of the entire affair. Her honest testimony and genuine distress at being unknowingly manipulated by Mrs. Cartwright had impressed both Inspector Craddock and the temporary estate administrators. Miss Marple learned that Sarah would receive promotion to assistant housekeeper at Meadowbrook Manor, with additional training in proper administrative procedures that would prevent future financial irregularities. Dr. Thorne has also written a letter of recommendation for nursing training. Sarah confided shyly during her visit to express gratitude. He says the district nursing trust that Lady Hetherington intended to establish will need competent, trustworthy staff. Mr. Penhaligon arrived in the afternoon, his professional composure gradually returning as he addressed the practical complexities of Mrs. Cartwright's crimes. The missing ledgers contained evidence of systematic fraud spanning 5 years, he reported with grim satisfaction. However, her meticulous record-keeping will actually facilitate complete restitution to the estate and affected charities. The codicil's intentions, though the document itself had been destroyed, could be honored through careful reconstruction of Lady Hetherington's stated wishes. The District Nursing Trust would receive its intended funding through recovered assets, while St. Mary's Church would finally receive the restoration funds that had been diverted through creative accounting. Miss Davies and Mr. Redding found their situations clarified as well. Lady Hetherington's unsigned note recommending the River Cottage lease would be formalized by Mr. Penhaligon, providing the artist with secure tenure while establishing Miss Davies as a patron of local cultural endeavors. Their earlier awkwardness had transformed into mutual respect based on shared experience of false suspicion. Mrs. Birch, the honest cook, assumed temporary responsibility for estate management with the assistance of a qualified administrator from the district office. Her straightforward competence provided reassurance that proper standards could be maintained without criminal innovation, though new oversight procedures would prevent future embezzlement. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple reflected on the psychological patterns that had driven this particular tragedy. Mrs. Cartwright had possessed genuine administrative talents, yet those very skills had enabled increasingly sophisticated fraud. Her intimate knowledge of Lady Hetherington's habits had provided both opportunity for theft and means for murder when exposure threatened. The most dangerous criminals? She observed to Inspector Craddock during his final visit, are often those who begin with legitimate authority and gradually corrupt it through small compromises that accumulate into major betrayals. Respectability provides perfect camouflage for systematic deception. The village would heal, as villages always did, though trust would be rebuilt cautiously after such comprehensive betrayal. The comfortable certainty that evil resided only beyond their borders had been permanently shattered, replaced by the harder wisdom that human nature contained both nobility and corruption in measures that defied easy prediction. As evening approached, Miss Marple completed the final stitches of her knitting project, a delicate pattern that had emerged slowly but inevitably throughout the investigation. Like the crime itself, the design appeared beautiful from a distance but revealed its true complexity only through patient, careful examination of each individual thread. Human nature, she reflected with quiet satisfaction, remained eternally consistent in its patterns, though infinite in its capacity to surprise those who observed with sufficient attention and understanding. 6 weeks had passed since that perfect summer afternoon when death arrived uninvited to Meadowbrook Manor's charity fete, and St. Mary Mead had begun the delicate process of healing that follows the exposure of long-hidden corruption. The village wore its familiar face once more. Shopkeepers arranged their windows with customary precision. Children resumed their games with gradually returning laughter, and the church bells maintained their ancient rhythm over cottages whose inhabitants had learned uncomfortable truths about the nature of respectability and trust. The final reckoning. Mrs. Amelia Cartwright's trial had concluded the previous week with a verdict that surprised no one who understood the methodical precision of her crimes. The evidence presented, 23 years of systematic embezzlement documented with the same obsessive care she had applied to estate management, left little room for legal maneuvering. Her defense counsel's attempts to portray her as a devoted servant driven to desperation by Lady Hetherington's demanding nature crumbled against the overwhelming proof of calculated murder disguised as afternoon hospitality. She maintained her administrative instincts to the very end. Inspector Craddock had reported during his final visit to Miss Marple. Even when the judge pronounced sentence, she corrected a minor error in the court clerk's recording of dates. 20 years imprisonment, and her primary concern remained clerical accuracy. The missing codicil's intentions had been honored through careful reconstruction of Lady Hetherington's stated wishes, while the recovered embezzled funds provided complete restitution to both the estate and affected charities. Mrs. Cartwright's meticulous record-keeping, ironically, had facilitated the very justice she had tried so desperately to prevent. Character, resolutions, and new beginnings. Dr. Geoffrey Thorne's practice had flourished beyond all expectations, his grace under false accusation transforming initial village skepticism into profound respect. The modern medical methods, once viewed with conservative suspicion, were now welcomed as evidence of professional competence rather than dangerous innovation. His establishment of the District Nursing Trust, exactly as Lady Hetherington had intended, provided both practical healthcare improvements and symbolic restoration of proper charitable purposes. Young Sarah Mills had emerged from the tragedy with remarkable transformation, her honest testimony and genuine distress at being unknowingly manipulated, earning her promotion to assistant housekeeper at Meadowbrook Manor. More significantly, Dr. Thorne's letter of recommendation had secured her placement in nursing training, where her experience with deception had given her invaluable understanding of the importance of absolute integrity in positions of trust. Miss Penelope Davies had evolved from nervous heiress into confident patron of village cultural life, her inheritance providing security that enabled genuine generosity rather than anxious hoarding. The River Cottage lease had been formalized as Lady Hetherington intended, establishing Mr. Charles Redding as both resident artist and cultural catalyst for the community. Their earlier awkwardness had transformed into mutual respect based on shared experience of false suspicion, though Miss Marple observed with gentle amusement that friendship might yet develop into something deeper as time allowed proper healing. Mr. Arthur Penhaligon had implemented comprehensive new procedures for estate administration that balanced necessary oversight with practical efficiency, his experience transforming him from nervous secret-keeper into confident guardian of legal propriety. The missing ledgers, recovered from Mrs. Cartwright's cottage, had provided prosecutors with irrefutable evidence while enabling complete financial restoration. Community healing and lessons learned. Mrs. Birch continued as interim estate manager with qualified oversight, her honest competence providing reassurance that proper standards could be maintained without criminal innovation. The new administrative safeguards, while initially cumbersome, had gained acceptance as necessary protection against future betrayal of trust. St. Mary's Church had received its restoration funds through recovered assets, and the east window now gleamed with medieval beauty that seemed almost too perfect after the tawdry revelations of modern crime. Mrs. Caroline Finch had channeled her considerable energies into legitimate fundraising with the zealous efficiency of someone seeking redemption for past gossip and hasty judgments. The village had learned to approach relationships with greater wisdom, recognizing that evil rarely announced itself with dramatic flourishes but instead wore familiar faces and committed its worst crimes through the corruption of trusted relationships. The comfortable certainty that wickedness resided only beyond their borders had been replaced by harder wisdom about human nature's infinite capacity for both nobility and corruption. Miss Marple's final reflections. As autumn's first frost touched her garden, Miss Marple sat with her completed knitting, a delicate shawl whose intricate pattern had emerged slowly but inevitably throughout the investigation, much like the crime itself. The design appeared beautiful from a distance but revealed its true complexity only through patient, careful examination of each individual thread. Human nature remains remarkably consistent. She reflected to Inspector Craddock during his farewell visit. The methods may evolve with changing circumstances, but the fundamental motivations, greed, fear, pride, desperation, continue to drive people toward choices they would never have imagined themselves capable of making. She thought of Mrs. Cartwright, whose genuine administrative talents had enabled increasingly sophisticated fraud, whose intimate knowledge of Lady Hetherington's habits had provided both opportunity for theft and means for murder when exposure threatened. The pattern was familiar, yet eternally instructive. Respectability providing perfect camouflage for systematic deception, service gradually corrupted into entitlement, trust weaponized against the very person who had granted it. The most dangerous criminals, Miss Marple observed gently, are often those who begin with legitimate authority and gradually corrupt it through small compromises that accumulate into major betrayals. Mrs. Cartwright possessed real competence. That was what made her crimes so particularly insidious. The investigation had revealed eternal truths about village life and human nature, that evil often wore familiar faces, that the most obvious suspect was rarely the true culprit, and that the greatest deceptions were woven into the very fabric of everyday respectability. Yet it had also demonstrated the community's capacity for healing, the power of integrity under pressure, and the ultimate triumph of careful observation over clever deception. The eternal pattern. As evening shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple secured her knitting with characteristic precision and smiled with quiet satisfaction. Another mystery had been solved through patient attention to the small details that revealed larger truths. Another killer had been brought to justice through understanding of human nature's predictable patterns. And another community had learned valuable lessons about the price of misplaced trust and the value of genuine integrity. The village would remember this case not merely as the afternoon when death arrived before tea was served, but as the day they learned that evil could flourish in the most respectable soil when tended by hands they had trusted completely. Yet they would also remember Dr. Thorne's grace under false accusation, Sarah Mills's honest courage despite personal risk, and their own capacity to heal and grow wiser through adversity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries, new opportunities to observe the eternal dance between human nobility and corruption. But tonight, Miss Marple could rest in the knowledge that justice had been served, wisdom had been gained, and the ancient patterns of human nature continued their fascinating, tragic, ultimately hopeful progression through the peaceful, yet eternally complex world of English village life. The tea service had been cleared away. The accounts had been balanced, and life continued with the resilient determination that characterized communities bound together by shared experience of both darkness and light. In her long career of observation and deduction, Miss Marple had learned that while individual crimes could be solved and individual criminals brought to justice, the deeper mystery of human nature, with its infinite capacity for both good and evil, remained as compelling and instructive as ever. And in that eternal mystery lay both the challenge and the comfort of her calling, to observe, to understand, and to ensure that justice, however delayed, would ultimately prevail through the careful application of wisdom, patience, and an unshakable faith in the power of truth to emerge from even the most carefully constructed deceptions.